Changes will soon take effect that involve what you can use for identification. We have details on those changes and what they mean for you. James May, the district press officer for PennDOT, joins us once again here today with some very important information regarding Pennsylvania driver's licenses being used as ID. There are some big changes coming that people need to be aware of, so we're glad that you came in so you could explain it all to us. First of all, how did this all come about that we cannot use the Pennsylvania driver's license as we used to?
Well, this is a question that we're getting asked quite a bit. A lot of people are seeing this. We have signs posted at the DMV announcing that this is happening. Essentially, let me back up and kind of give a background on what has happened and how we got to this point. Shortly after September 11th, when we had the attack on our nation, the federal government came along and said, we want to implement some stronger laws in regard to things like driver's license. There were a number of aspects to what they wanted to do. Things like they wanted people to no longer be able to renew your driver's license online. You can't do a change of address online. When you go in for your license, you would not be able to have it issued right there. It had to come from a centralized location. Just a whole lot of changes that the federal government said this is part of a Real ID Law Act, and that was implemented by the federal government, Washington, D.C. The state government came along and they had some concerns with that law. A lot of their concerns had to do with the cost that would be incurred by the state when you start doing all this stuff, the additional lines at the DMV. Right now you can do a driver's license renewal online, or you can do your change of address online. Under the new law, you would have to physically take your birth certificate and your social security card, drive down to the DMV every time you move. So for someone like my son, who's a young kid moving every 6 months or so, every time you would have to go in. And they looked and they said, it's going to be too much for the lines, too much for the cost. We are not going to participate in Real ID. They also had some concerns with the whole concept of an ID card being issued by the central government, by the federal government, and there were some kind of the big brother concerns. So both agencies, the federal government had some legitimate reasons why they were doing what they were doing. The state government had some legitimate reasons for doing why they were doing, but the state government came along and they passed a law that said, we will not participate in Real ID. Pennsylvania is one of 9 states that came along and said, we are not going to take part. We will have nothing to do with Real ID. And the Pennsylvania state legislature even passed a law that says, PennDOT, you may not do any changes to your driver's license that will comply with Real ID because we are not going to be a partner and a participant with this. So PennDOT right now is in the middle. And what is taking place now, because of that, because we are not participating in Real ID, the federal government is coming along and saying, okay, the new laws say unless you have a driver's license that is Real ID compliant, you no longer can go into federal buildings unless you're going in for some sort of assistance. But you can no longer go into federal buildings. This would mean like a military base, a nuclear facility, any federal building, you can no longer go in unless you have a driver's license that is Real ID compliant or a federal issued, like a passport, something along those lines. That's going to be taking place this month. That portion of the law will go into effect. A year from now, in January of 2018, the portion of the law that I think a lot of people are concerned about is the portion where it says you can no longer fly, even commercially, you cannot fly on an airplane unless you have an ID card that is Real ID compliant. That means when you fly to Florida to go to Disney World or you fly to visit Grandma and Grandpa in Iowa, you would have to have if you're a Pennsylvania resident, you would have to have some form of ID that is issued by the federal government. That's usually a passport or a photo ID type of thing from the federal government. So that's where we are right now. And it's really in the hands of the legislature, who has to come into some sort of agreement with Congress. And the two of them need to work this out. And until they do, really there's nothing that PennDOT can do. And in fact, we are ordered by state law to do nothing until it's resolved.
So what's the best advice for people? Because at the end of this month, there will be some changes that will probably impact people.
Well, especially if you're somebody who needs access to a federal building. I've been contacted already by some truck drivers who deliver iced tea, but they deliver it to federal buildings and a nuclear facility. I would begin the process right now. You can go online and you can see a list of the acceptable forms of ID. You would have to go to the same process that you would do for a passport. You would have to get a passport or a passport photo. Do that sooner rather than later because it does take a while for that whole process to get processed. And so make sure you do that right away. And between now and next year, we're really hoping that the legislature and Congress will be able to work something out to get this whole issue resolved.
All right, it's complicated, but
It
best
is,
advice
yeah.
is to get an ID so that you're covered in all aspects. And if there are any changes, of course, you'll be back to give us an update on what's transpiring with all this.
I will, yes.
All right. James May from PennDOT.